I did my field work for the diaconate at St. Stephen's Episcopal Church in Belvedere, California. And whatever he introduced me, the rector at St. Stephen's would say, "Stephen was a deacon, you know, and he was beheaded." I spent the whole term trying to figure out whether he meant that I should aspire to martyrdom as well. And in the way of all formation, I began to think maybe the ordained life was just too noble for me, because I didn't think I could volunteer to lose my head to it. It reminded me of that crazy time during McCarthyism when the teachers at my Catholic school told me in the second grade that I had to keep the faith even when the communists came and hung me up by my fingernails. I did push on toward ordination, as you can see, and I haven't lost my head yet. I lost my heart to it instead. Today is the feast of St. Philip the Deacon, one of the very first deacons or deacon prototypes in the church. Father Robert thought it would be a good idea for me to say a few things about St. Philip and about deacons in the context of the readings. And what readings they are. We have these lovely, lovely pieces from Isaiah and from the Psalm which celebrate the bounteous goodness of our God. The Isaiah reading is thought not to be about an event or a particular time, but about what happens when we are released from something dreadful and enormous. It's meant to be, you know, that giddy relief you feel when you realize that whatever it was is over, and it's a miracle, and it could only have been through an act of God. The images here convey that sense of deep security. God is called a refuge to the poor, a refuge to the needy, a shelter from the rainstorm. And of course, the words of the 23rd Psalm, which always bring tears. "Surely your goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." Here is the vision of God, and the realm of God as a sanctuary for all people, no matter who they are, and especially for people who have no other sanctuary. And then after the word from Paul, there's that burning hot gospel with that crazed king who is on a jealous rampage because no one will come to the son's banquet, not to mention the ill-mannered invited guests who murder the servants. It's meant to get our attention. As we are seeing so painfully these days, the historical context cannot be ignored here. The author of Matthew's Gospel wrote in the 2 decades after the Romans destroyed the temple in 70, the time of division and unrest among the Jews and the Jewish Christians and the Christians, especially the Hebrew-speaking Jews and the Greek-speaking Jews. One religion sharply divided. As Matthew tries to call his community to the one church of Jesus Christ as he understands it, he gets more irritable and more threatening in his parables. Here in the parable of the king and the wedding feast, he presents religious leaders who are seen as corrupt and hypocritical as the first guests who were invited, but too preoccupied with their own concerns, too smug in their privilege to bother to attend. But the king doesn't stop there. He will not cancel the banquet. Instead, he brings in everybody he can scrape together from the streets, because this is, after all, a story about God's invitation to participate fully in his beloved community. In the same historical time period as that of this gospel, there arose a complaint that the social service network of the church was failing for the Greek-speaking widows. They were not being taken care of in the way that they should have been in the eyes of Greek-speaking Jews, Greek-speaking Jews becoming Christians. And it's hard to know what that meant, actually, but it had enough momentum and merit to spur the apostles into action. And in a profoundly inspired move, the apostles didn't come up with a solution on their own. They asked community what should happen. If only we could follow that example. The solution was to designate 7 Greek-speaking men to provide for the Greek widows, and these men may have been known as deacons. Philip was one of these men. From this story, you can see the popular notion of the function of deacon as a table server, has waxed and waned over the centuries. And the function of the deacon as a messenger, the one who invites people to the banquet, has been reduced to the proclamation of the gospel at the Eucharist. The thing about Philip was that he wasn't the kind of deacon to be narrowly defined. He was no social worker for the early church. His work gives us a broader picture of what those deacons in the early church did and what was meant by the term diaconia. Philip was a preacher and baptizer who traveled. He famously baptized an Ethiopian eunuch who became the first Coptic Christian. And he then went to preach to the Samaritans, which, as we know, was an act of subversion because Samaritans were severe critics of Jews. Deacons are often called by the Spirit to venture where no one else will go. Paul has a lot to say about diaconia. He says in that verse that we love to quote from Ephesians, that the purpose of the work of the church is to equip the saints for works of mercy, which Paul calls diaconia. He says in 2 Corinthians, all this is from God, who reconciled himself to us through Christ, and that has given us the ministry, or diaconia, as he says in the original, of reconciliation. Diaconia is the work of reconciling others to God through the service of justice and mercy. So deacons were created in a time when the church was struggling to live into and up to the creed of its founder, a time like our own. They came into being because the debate over what it meant to be Christian had eclipsed the act of being Christian. One might say that the minority group of Christians, the Greek widows, had been disproportionately affected by the internal conflict which infected the new church. Those deacons were called into being to redistribute the resources of the community so that the widows might have what they needed. There is a powerful message here about where the church lives out the dream and directives of its founder. Not in the councils of the church hierarchy, not in the teaching and preaching, not in the rules and regulations, but in its attention to the needs of those who have been overlooked, in its attention to the vulnerable, the oppressed, and the ostracized, because it doesn't matter how well you preach love or issue statements regarding justice if your people are still hungry and alienated. The work of diaconia, and for me, the practice of being a deacon, is that nowhere else have I ever felt so able to lose myself. Now I see how Stephen the martyr lost his head. There is nowhere else that I can feel as aware of God. And when I get right down to it, eye to eye with what needs to be done, there is no I and no you anymore. There's no more than or less than. There is only life itself, the breath of God, blowing through us all. And there is such joy there. So I know what it means when Isaiah says, the Lord God will wipe away the tears from all faces, and the disgrace of his people he will take away from all the earth. I'm glad that I haven't had to lose my head yet. But if I had another 5 hearts to lose, I would gladly give them to this work. And I thank you for letting me be your deacon.